The morning sun was barely peeking through the tall buildings of downtown when Officer James Cooper stepped out of his police car. He adjusted his belt, making sure his badge caught the early light, something he took pride in every single day. At 35 years old, Cooper had been patrolling these streets for the past 7 years, and he had grown increasingly frustrated with what he saw as the declining state of his beat. The smell of fresh coffee from Joe's coffee shop drifted through the air, mixing with the less pleasant odors of the city. Cooper walked past the growing line of well-dressed office workers, nodding at those who caught his eye. He liked these people, the productive ones, as he called them. They were the ones who, in his mind, made the city work. But then he saw her again. Sarah Mitchell sat quietly on her worn cardboard, her back against the brick wall of the coffee shop. She was reading yesterday's newspaper, her fingers gently turning the pages despite being rough from living on the streets. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and her clothes, though old, were as clean as she could keep them. "Still here, are we?" Cooper's voice carried that familiar tone of disgust. He stood over her, his shadow blocking her light. "Don't you have somewhere else to be, like not in front of a business?" Sarah looked up slowly, her blue eyes tired but still holding a spark of dignity. She began gathering her few possessions: the newspaper, a small bag containing everything she owned, and the thin blanket she sat on. "I'm not causing any trouble, Officer Cooper," she said softly, knowing his name from their many previous encounters. "Just reading the paper until the shelter opens at noon." Cooper scoffed, pulling out his notepad in an exaggerated gesture. "You know, I could write you up for loitering. Again, or maybe this time for disturbing the peace." A young barista from the coffee shop watched through the window, frowning at the scene unfolding outside. She had often seen Sarah and knew her as the quiet woman who never bothered anyone, who always said thank you for the occasional free coffee, and who helped keep an eye on the alley behind the shop. "The peace?" Sarah asked, her voice still calm. "I'm just sitting here quietly." "Your presence is disturbing enough," Cooper snapped, gesturing at her worn clothes and the small cart containing her belongings. "You're bad for business. Nobody wants to see this first thing in the morning." A few passers-by slowed their walk, some shooting disapproving looks at Cooper, others pretending not to notice. Sarah stood up slowly, her joints stiff from the cool morning air. She was about 60. The life on the streets made her look older. "I'll move along, officer," she said, dignity intact despite his harsh words. She carefully folded her cardboard and placed it in her small cart, making sure not to leave anything behind. Sarah had always been mindful of keeping the areas she occupied clean. Cooper watched her pack up, tapping his pen against his notepad impatiently. "And don't let me catch you here again tomorrow. There's a perfectly good bench 3 blocks down by the bus station." What Cooper didn't know, what he had never bothered to ask, was that the bench he mentioned was already claimed by a group of younger homeless men who weren't as peaceful as Sarah. She knew better than to go there, having learned the hard way about territorial disputes on the streets. As Sarah pushed her cart away, Linda, the coffee shop owner, came outside. She had watched the whole interaction through the window and couldn't stay quiet anymore. "Officer Cooper," she called out, her voice firm. "That woman has never caused any problems. In fact, she helps keep troublemakers away from my back door." Cooper turned to Linda, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job, keeping the streets clean and safe for business owners like yourself." "Safe from what? A 60-year-old woman reading a newspaper?" Linda shook her head disapprovingly. "Sometimes I wonder if you know what real trouble looks like." Cooper ignored Linda's comments and walked away, continuing his patrol. In his mind, he was doing the right thing, keeping the streets clear of what he saw as nuisances. He didn't care about Sarah's story or why she was there. To him, she was just another problem to solve, another obstacle to remove from his perfect vision of how his beat should look. As he turned the corner, he didn't notice Sarah helping a lost child find his mother, or the grateful smile the worried parent gave her. He didn't see her pick up some scattered trash near the bus stop, or the way she gave her last granola bar to a hungry teenager who had run away from home. These small acts of kindness were invisible to Officer Cooper, hidden behind his wall of prejudice and assumption. Sarah Mitchell walked slowly away from the coffee shop, pushing her cart with practiced care over the cracked sidewalk. As she made her way toward the public library where she spent most of her days, her mind drifted back to the life she had lived just 3 years ago, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. The golden morning light caught her wedding ring, which she still wore. It was the one thing she had refused to sell, even during the darkest times. Sarah touched it gently, remembering the day Tom had placed it on her finger 28 years ago. Tom had been a high school teacher, and she had worked as a registered nurse at City General Hospital. They had lived a simple but happy life in their small suburban house. Finding a quiet bench in the park, Sarah sat down and pulled out an old photo from her bag. In it, she wore blue nursing scrubs, standing proudly next to Tom in front of their house. She had been the head nurse in the emergency room, known for her gentle touch with scared patients and her quick thinking in crisis situations. "Excuse me, miss," a timid voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah looked up to see Maria, a young homeless woman she had met recently, holding her arm. "It's bleeding again." Sarah carefully put away her photo and pulled out a small first aid kit from her cart, one of the few things she had kept from her nursing days. With practiced hands, she cleaned Maria's wound, an injury from climbing a fence while trying to find a safe place to sleep. "You're good at this," Maria said, watching Sarah work. "Where did you learn?" Sarah smiled softly as she applied a clean bandage. "I was a nurse for 25 years. Emergency room." She paused, then added, "Life can change quickly, dear. One day you're helping others in a hospital, the next day you're—" She gestured to her cart. The change had come suddenly. Tom had complained of headaches for weeks, but they both thought it was just stress from teaching. When he collapsed in his classroom, the diagnosis was devastating, an aggressive brain tumor. The medical bills piled up quickly, even with insurance. They used their savings, sold their car, and eventually remortgaged their house. Tom fought hard for 8 months, but the cancer was stronger. After he died, Sarah found herself drowning in medical debt. She picked up extra shifts at the hospital, but it wasn't enough. The bank foreclosed on their house. Her car, already sold for Tom's treatment, meant she had to take the bus to work. When the hospital downsized, Sarah, emotionally exhausted and missing too many shifts caring for Tom, was let go. She tried to find another nursing job, but without a permanent address and struggling with grief, it became impossible. One night at a shelter turned into a week, then a month. Now, 3 years later, she was still here, carrying her nursing skills and her dignity with her on the streets. "There you go," Sarah said to Maria, finishing with the bandage. "Keep it clean, and come find me if it starts looking red or feels hot." Word had spread among the homeless community about Nurse Sarah. She treated their wounds, advised them about their medications, and sometimes just listened to their problems. The local free clinic doctors had noticed how many of their homeless patients came in with surprisingly well-dressed wounds, though they never knew who was helping them. Linda, the coffee shop owner, came out with a paper cup and a small paper bag. "Sarah," she called softly, "we had some extra breakfast sandwiches today." This was their daily routine. Linda would always find some extra food to share. "Thank you, Linda," Sarah said, accepting the food gracefully. She knew it wasn't really extra. Linda was just kind. She took half the sandwich out and gave it to Maria. As they ate, Sarah watched the morning commuters hurry past. She recognized many of them, the young lawyer who always wore red heels, the old man with his crossword puzzle, the twins who worked at the bank. She didn't want their pity, but sometimes she wished they could see past her current situation to the person she still was inside. A siren wailed in the distance, and Sarah's hands instinctively twitched, muscle memory from years of responding to emergencies. She might not wear scrubs anymore, but she was still a nurse at heart. Even Officer Cooper's daily insults couldn't take that away from her. She knew who she was, even if the world saw her differently now. The morning air was extra cold as winter crept closer to the city. Frost covered the ground, making the sidewalks slippery, and people's breath came out in small white clouds. Sarah sat in her usual spot near the coffee shop, wearing 3 layers of clothes to fight against the biting cold. Her fingers, red from the cold, held onto a cup of warm tea that Linda had given her earlier. Officer Cooper arrived earlier than usual that morning. His mood was particularly dark after getting a stern email from his supervisor about increased complaints in his area. He had spent the night shift dealing with a group of rowdy teenagers, and now, seeing Sarah in her usual spot made something snap inside him. "That's it," he said loudly, marching toward her. "I've had enough of this." His voice was sharp enough to make several passersby stop and watch. How many times do I have to tell you to stay away from here? Sarah looked up, her eyes showing a hint of fear she hadn't displayed before. Officer Cooper, please. It's too cold this morning. I'm just trying to stay warm until. I don't want to hear your excuses. Cooper cut her off. He reached down and grabbed her small bag of possessions. This is probably all stolen anyway. Let's see what we have here. No, please. Sarah's voice cracked as she reached for her bag. Those are my personal things. You have no right. Cooper dumped the contents of her bag onto the sidewalk. Out fell her precious photo of Tom, her nursing certificate kept in a plastic sleeve, some clean bandages, and a small first aid kit. Her wedding ring, which she had taken off to clean that morning, rolled across the concrete. Sarah scrambled to catch her ring before it could fall into a drain. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched it tightly. The morning crowd had grown larger, with many people stopping to watch the scene unfold. Phones came out, recording the interaction. A nursing certificate? Cooper scoffed, picking up the plastic-covered document. Yeah, right. Probably found this in the trash. He tossed it aside, the plastic sleeve skidding across the icy sidewalk. Linda burst out of her coffee shop, unable to watch anymore. Officer Cooper, stop this right now. She rushed to help Sarah gather her belongings. This is harassment. Stay out of this, Cooper warned, putting his hand up to stop Linda. This is police business. She's been warned repeatedly about loitering. She's a human being. Linda shouted, her voice echoing off the buildings. She's not hurting anyone. More people had gathered now. Among them was Captain Roberts, Cooper's superior officer, who had stopped for his morning coffee. He watched silently from the crowd, taking in every detail of his officer's behavior. Sarah's hands trembled as she tried to collect her scattered belongings. The photo of Tom had landed in a puddle, the water slowly seeping into the paper, blurring their happy faces. This broke something in Sarah, and for the first time since becoming homeless, she raised her voice. That was the last picture I had of my husband, she said, her voice shaking but clear. He was a teacher. He died of cancer. I was a nurse for 25 years before I lost everything paying for his treatment. She stood up slowly, facing Cooper. You wear that badge to protect people, Officer Cooper. All people, even the ones you don't think deserve it. The crowd had grown silent, hanging on every word. Captain Roberts stepped forward, his face stern. Officer Cooper. Cooper spun around, his face draining of color as he recognized his superior. Captain, my office. Now. Captain Roberts's voice was cold. He turned to Sarah, his tone softening. Ma'am, I apologize for this officer's behavior. Please, gather your belongings. You have every right to be here. As Cooper walked away with his captain, the crowd began to disperse. Linda and several others helped Sarah collect her things. Someone offered to try drying out the photo, another gave her their scarf, and a businessman handed her enough money for a hot meal. Sarah sat back down, clutching her damaged photo, her nursing certificate, and her wedding ring. She was shaking, but not just from the cold. For the first time in years, she had stood up for herself. She didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything, not just for her, but for Officer Cooper too, though in ways neither of them could imagine. 2 weeks had passed since the incident with Sarah. Officer Cooper was working the night shift now, a change his captain had ordered after the scene at the coffee shop. The cold night air felt different from his usual morning patrols, and the streets were quieter, darker, and somehow lonelier. Cooper sat in his patrol car, parked near Wilson's convenience store, finishing up some paperwork. It was almost midnight, and his mind kept drifting back to Sarah's words about his badge and protecting all people. He hadn't seen her since that day, and something about that bothered him, though he tried to ignore the feeling. The quiet night suddenly erupted with the sound of breaking glass. Cooper looked up to see 2 masked figures running out of Wilson's store. Through the broken window, you could see Mr. Wilson, the elderly owner, lying on the floor. Dispatch, this is Officer Cooper. Armed robbery in progress at Wilson's convenience store on 5th and Pine. Suspects fleeing on foot, heading east, requesting backup. Cooper jumped out of his car, his heart pounding as he started the pursuit. The robbers split up at the end of the block. Cooper followed the larger suspect, the one carrying what looked like a gun. They raced down a narrow alley between two old brick buildings, past overflowing dumpsters and scattered boxes. "Stop! Police!" Cooper shouted, his flashlight beam bouncing off the wet walls of the alley. The suspect turned briefly, and something metal glinted in the light. Before Cooper could react, a sharp crack echoed through the alley. The pain hit him before he heard the gunshot. His right leg buckled, and he fell hard against a dumpster. His radio flew from his belt, skidding across the wet pavement and cracking against the wall. The suspect disappeared around the corner, leaving Cooper alone in the dark alley. Officer down, he tried to speak into his shoulder radio, only to realize it wasn't there. The pain in his leg was intense, and he could feel warm blood soaking through his uniform. He pressed his hands against the wound, but the blood kept coming. Cooper tried to reach his phone, but it had been damaged in the fall. He could hear sirens in the distance, but they sounded far away. The alley was hidden from the main street, and he knew his backup might not find him in time. His training told him he needed to stay awake, but the blood loss was making him dizzy. The world started to blur around the edges. Was this how it would end? In a dark alley, alone? Through his fading consciousness, Cooper heard a rustling sound from behind some cardboard boxes. He tried to reach for his gun, but his arms felt too heavy. A figure emerged from the shadows, and for a moment, he thought the suspect had returned. "Officer Cooper." A familiar voice called out softly. "Don't move. You're bleeding badly." Even in his confused state, he recognized her voice. It was Sarah. She had been sleeping in her hidden spot behind the dumpster, out of sight from the street, the same spot he would have made her leave if he had known about it during his day shifts. "Sarah?" His voice was weak. "The suspect. He's armed." "He's gone," Sarah said firmly, already moving with purpose. She pulled off her cleanest scarf and began tearing it into strips. "I'm going to help you, but you need to stay still." Her hands moved with professional precision, checking his wound before creating a tourniquet. "The bullet hit your femoral artery," she explained, her nurse's training taking over. "I need to stop the bleeding." Cooper wanted to say something, maybe apologize, maybe thank her, but the words wouldn't come. The pain was overwhelming, and the world was getting darker. But he could feel Sarah's steady hands working to save him, the same hands he had forced to pick up scattered belongings from the cold sidewalk just 2 weeks ago. "Stay with me, officer." Sarah's voice was calm but firm. "Help is coming. I can hear the sirens getting closer." She kept pressure on his wound while watching his face carefully for signs of shock. "Talk to me. Tell me about your family. You have children?" Through the fog of pain and blood loss, Cooper realized the strange irony of his situation. The woman he had treated with so much contempt was now the only thing standing between him and death in this dark alley. Sarah's hands moved quickly and steadily as she worked to keep Officer Cooper alive. The alley was dark, but her years of emergency room experience had taught her how to work in difficult conditions. She had pulled her small flashlight from her cart, holding it between her teeth to see better as she tightened the tourniquet. "Officer Cooper, I need you to stay awake," she said firmly, noticing his eyes starting to close. "Tell me about your morning routine. What do you usually have for breakfast?" Cooper's voice came out weak and shaky. "Coffee, 2 sugars, toast." He was struggling to stay conscious, his face growing paler by the minute. Sarah checked his pulse. It was rapid but weakening. She knew she needed to keep him talking. "That's good. Keep telling me more. Where do you get your coffee?" "Joe's shop." Cooper's eyes focused on her face for a moment. "Why? Why are you helping me?" Sarah adjusted the pressure on his wound, her hands steady despite the cold. "Because that's what humans do, Officer Cooper. We help each other." She paused, listening to the sirens getting closer. "And because I took an oath as a nurse, I will not permit considerations of age, disease or disability, creed, ethnic origin, gender, nationality, political affiliation, race, sexual orientation, social standing, or any other factor to stand between my duty and my patient." Through his pain-filled haze, Cooper recognized the words, the nursing pledge. He had seen it hanging on the wall at the hospital when his mother was sick last year, but he had never really thought about what it meant until now. Sarah noticed him shivering and quickly pulled a clean blanket from her cart, covering him to prevent shock. The blanket was one of her most precious possessions, but she didn't hesitate to use it. "The bullet? It hurts?" Cooper's voice was barely a whisper now. I know it does, Sarah said softly, her voice calm and reassuring, the same voice she had used countless times in the ER. But you're doing great. Help is almost here. Just stay with me. She could hear police cars getting closer, but they were stopping at the front of the alley where the chase had started. They didn't know their officer was hidden behind the dumpster. Help! Sarah shouted as loud as she could. Officer down. Back here. She kept one hand firmly on Cooper's wound while waving her flashlight with the other. Cooper's eyes fluttered. I'm sorry, he whispered. The photo? Your husband. Sure, Sarah soothed, checking his pulse again. Save your strength. We can talk about that later. She called out again, back here. He's losing blood. Finally, flashlight beams swept down the alley. Over here. Sarah called. He needs immediate medical attention. Gunshot wound to the right leg, femoral artery involvement. The other officers rushed toward them, weapons drawn until they realized the situation. Sarah spoke quickly and professionally. He's lost approximately 2 units of blood. I've applied a tourniquet and maintained pressure, but he needs immediate transport. The paramedics arrived moments later, and Sarah helped transfer Cooper onto the stretcher, explaining everything she had done. Her medical knowledge and calm professionalism surprised the emergency responders. Ma'am, are you a medical professional? One paramedic asked as they prepared to move Cooper. I was an ER nurse for 25 years at City General, Sarah replied, still holding pressure on the wound as they moved. He's going to need immediate surgery to repair the artery. As they rushed Cooper to the ambulance, his hand suddenly reached out and caught Sarah's wrist. His eyes opened briefly, clearer than they had been. Thank you, he whispered. Please, come to the hospital, I need. But before he could finish, his eyes closed again, and the paramedics rushed him away. Sarah stood in the alley, her hands covered in Cooper's blood, watching the ambulance speed away with its sirens wailing. She looked down at her bloody blanket and scarf, the few possessions she had sacrificed without hesitation to save the life of a man who had shown her nothing but contempt. One of the officers approached her carefully. Ma'am, we'll need to take your statement. And, would you like a ride to the hospital? The steady beeping of hospital monitors filled room 412 as Officer Cooper slowly opened his eyes. White ceiling tiles came into focus, and the sharp smell of disinfectant reminded him where he was. 3 days had passed since the shooting, though he had been unconscious for most of that time. His leg was elevated, wrapped in thick bandages. The doctors had told him he was lucky. If the tourniquet hadn't been applied so quickly and professionally, he would have bled out in that alley. The word lucky kept playing in his mind, along with memories of Sarah's calm voice keeping him awake. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Captain Roberts entered, carrying a paper cup of coffee and a manila folder. How are you feeling, Cooper? The captain asked, pulling up a chair beside the bed. Better, sir, Cooper replied, trying to sit up straighter. Any news about the shooter? We caught him this morning, Roberts nodded. But that's not why I'm here. He opened the folder and pulled out several papers. I've been doing some research on your lifesaver, Sarah Mitchell. Cooper's chest tightened with shame as he remembered their last interaction before the shooting. Sir, Let me finish. Roberts held up his hand. Sarah Mitchell was the head nurse in the emergency department at City General for 15 years. Before that, she worked in trauma units in 3 different hospitals. She has saved more lives than most of our emergency responders. He laid out some old newspaper clippings. One showed Sarah receiving an award for her work during a major bus accident. Another featured her organizing a free clinic for low-income families. Her husband, Thomas Mitchell, was a high school science teacher for 30 years. Roberts continued. When he got sick, they had insurance, but it wasn't enough. The experimental treatment that might have saved him wasn't covered. They spent everything they had trying to save his life. Cooper stared at the photos, seeing a different Sarah than the one he had known on the streets. In these pictures, she wore clean scrubs and a confident smile. She looked professional, respected, everything he had refused to see in her. The thing is, Cooper, Roberts leaned forward, she's still that same person. The skills that saved your life in that alley are the same ones she used in the ER. The only thing that changed was her circumstances, and how people like us treated her because of them. A nurse came in to check Cooper's vitals, and he noticed her name tag, Linda Martinez, RN. For the first time, he really looked at her, wondering about her story, her life. How many times had he passed other people on his beat without really seeing them? Is she here? Cooper asked after the nurse left. Sarah? Roberts shook his head. She gave her statement about the shooting and disappeared. The officers offered her a ride to the hospital, but she said she needed to help someone else. Apparently, there's a pregnant woman in the homeless community she's been looking after. Cooper closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his past actions. I treated her like she was nothing, Captain. Worse than nothing. And she still saved my life. Yes, she did, Roberts agreed. The question is, what are you going to do with that life now? Before Cooper could answer, his doctor entered the room. Dr. Williams had been treating him since he was brought in, and today she had news. Officer Cooper, she said, reviewing his chart, the surgery was successful, but I need to be clear, without the immediate medical attention you received at the scene, you wouldn't have made it to the hospital. Whoever treated you knew exactly what they were doing. They must have had extensive trauma experience. She did, Cooper said quietly, 25 years of it. The doctor looked interested. Well, we're always looking for skilled nurses at the hospital. If you know someone. Cooper sat up straighter, ignoring the pain in his leg. Something the doctor said had given him an idea. He turned to Captain Roberts. Sir, I need your help with something. We need to find Sarah. Not just to thank her, but because I think I know how we can make things right. Roberts smiled slightly, seeing the change in his officer's eyes. What do you have in mind, Cooper? Something that might help not just Sarah, but others like her, Cooper said, his mind already forming a plan. But first, I need to apologize properly for who I was, and thank her for showing me who I could be. 2 weeks after leaving the hospital, Officer Cooper sat in his patrol car outside the local homeless shelter. His leg was still healing, and he used a cane to walk, but he had insisted on coming back to work. This time, though, everything looked different to him. He watched as people entered and left the shelter. Each face now made him wonder about their story. Was that elderly man a former teacher? Could that young woman have been a doctor? He thought about how quickly life could change, remembering Sarah's words about her own journey from respected nurse to homeless survivor. Ready to go in? Captain Roberts asked, tapping on the car window. Cooper nodded and carefully got out of the car, leaning on his cane. Inside the shelter, Cooper spoke with the staff and residents, something he had never done before. He learned their names, heard their stories, and with each conversation, his shame about his past behavior grew, along with his determination to make things right. We're looking for Sarah Mitchell, Cooper explained to Maria. The young woman Sarah had often helped with medical issues. Do you know where we might find her? Maria studied Cooper's face carefully, recognizing him from before. Why should I tell you? So you can harass her again? Cooper's face showed genuine regret. No, I want to thank her for saving my life, and I want to offer her a chance to help others again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. I have something for her. Something that might help her get back to nursing. Maria's expression softened slightly. She usually helps at the free clinic on Thursdays, the one behind the Methodist church. Cooper and Roberts drove to the clinic. As they walked in, they found Sarah wrapping an ace bandage around an old man's sprained ankle. She looked up as they entered, her hands pausing for just a moment before continuing her work. There you go, Mr. Jenkins, she said kindly to the old man. Remember to keep it elevated. She turned to face the officers, standing straight and dignified despite her worn clothes. Officer Cooper. Captain Roberts. Ms. Mitchell. Cooper stepped forward, leaning on his cane. I've been looking for you. I needed to. He paused, taking a deep breath. I needed to apologize. Not just for how I treated you that last morning, but for every morning before that. I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Sarah watched him quietly, her expression calm but cautious. Cooper continued, You saved my life in that alley. You could have walked away after how I treated you, but you didn't. You lived up to your nursing oath, even when I had failed to live up to my police oath. He handed her the envelope with slightly shaking hands. This is a letter of recommendation from Captain Roberts and the hospital where I was treated. Dr. Williams was impressed by how you handled my injury. The hospital wants to offer you a position in their emergency department. Sarah's eyes widened as she opened the envelope. Cooper wasn't finished. We've also arranged for temporary housing near the hospital, and the police department's community fund will help with uniforms and other initial expenses. It's not charity, Ms. Mitchell. It's an investment in someone who never stopped being a nurse, even when the world turned its back on her. Tears formed in Sarah's eyes as she read the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept, Cooper replied softly. Not just for yourself, but for all the people who need your skills. And, he gestured to the clinic around them, say you'll help me set up a program to identify other homeless individuals with medical training. People who could be helped back into their professions. Sarah looked around the small clinic, at the people waiting for help, then back at the letter in her hands. It won't be easy, she said quietly. Starting over at my age. No, Cooper agreed. But you won't be alone this time. I promise you that. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out something else, her nursing certificate, now cleaned and in a new protective sleeve. I believe this belongs to you, Nurse Mitchell. For the first time since he'd known her, Sarah smiled fully, the kind of smile he had seen in her old photographs. When do I start? 1 year later, Officer Cooper stood in the main hall of City General Hospital, watching as people gathered for a special ceremony. His leg had healed completely, though cold weather sometimes reminded him of that night in the alley. But the physical reminder wasn't what had truly changed him. It was the woman now walking toward the podium, wearing clean blue scrubs with a name tag that read Sarah Mitchell, RN Program Director. Sarah had not only returned to nursing, but had exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months, she had created a program called Second Chance Medicine, which helped homeless individuals with medical backgrounds return to healthcare professions. Today was the graduation ceremony for their first class of participants. Cooper smiled as he recognized many faces in the crowd. There was Maria, who they discovered had been a medical student before family problems forced her to drop out. She was now back in medical school. Mr. Jenkins, the man with the sprained ankle, turned out to be a former pharmacist. He now worked at the hospital pharmacy. Even Linda from the coffee shop was there, having become one of the program's biggest supporters. Good morning, everyone, Sarah began her speech, her voice confident and strong. 1 year ago, I was living on the streets, using my nursing skills to help others who had also fallen on hard times. Today, I stand before you not just as a nurse, but as living proof that second chances are real. She looked at Cooper in the audience, smiling slightly. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the person who seems to be your biggest obstacle becomes your strongest ally, and sometimes it takes nearly losing everything to find out who you really are. Cooper thought back to his own journey. After Sarah's return to nursing, he had changed how he patrolled his beat. Instead of seeing problems to solve, he now saw people who needed help. His fellow officers had noticed the change, and many had followed his example. The department now had a special unit dedicated to connecting homeless individuals with resources and opportunities. Today, we celebrate 10 graduates of our Second Chance Medicine program, Sarah continued. These incredible individuals never lost their skills or their desire to help others. They just needed someone to believe in them. And now, they will return to their professions, bringing not just their medical knowledge, but also their deep understanding of how life can change in an instant. As Sarah called each graduate to receive their new hospital ID badges, Cooper remembered something she had told him during his recovery. The uniform, whether it's nursing scrubs or a police badge, doesn't make the person. It's what's in their heart that matters. After the ceremony, Cooper approached Sarah as she chatted with some of the graduates. She excused herself and walked over to meet him. Quite different from our first morning meetings at the coffee shop, she said with a gentle laugh. Cooper shook his head, smiling. I was so blind back then. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that alley that night. Everything happens for a reason, Officer Cooper, Sarah said, then corrected herself. James, even the bad things can lead to something good. Look around. Because of what happened that night, all these people have their lives back. They looked at the celebrating graduates. One was hugging his children who had come to watch. Another was showing her new hospital ID to her elderly mother, who was crying with joy. These weren't just medical professionals returning to work. These were people returning to life. The next class starts next month, Sarah mentioned. We already have 15 participants, including a former dentist and 2 nurses. The hospital has agreed to expand the program to other departments. Cooper nodded, then reached into his pocket. Actually, that's why I'm here. Captain Roberts asked me to give you this. He handed her an envelope. The police department wants to officially partner with Second Chance Medicine. We want to help identify more candidates during our patrols. Sarah opened the envelope and read the proposal, her eyes brightening. This could help so many more people. That's the plan, Cooper said. After all, everyone deserves a second chance. You taught me that. As they stood there, Linda walked up with coffee cups for both of them. Just like old times, but everything was different now. The morning sun streamed through the hospital windows, catching Sarah's nurse's badge and Cooper's police badge, both symbols now representing not authority, but hope.